I think we're ready to go. Delegate Chang, you want to open up?
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Spending Affordability Committee. Senator Jim Rosapep, Chair on the Senate side, and myself. Welcome, everyone, today of being here. We have from the House Appropriations Committee, Chairman Ben Barnes and the entire Appropriations Committee, and from the House Ways and Means Committee, we have Chair Vanessa Atterbury and also Vice Chair Janelle Wilkins. We'll go through the fiscal briefing by the Department of Legislative Services and go through the presentations. After all the presentations are presented, we'll go ahead and take questions from the members. If the Department of Legislative Services would start off, we'll go with the overview by David Romans.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This afternoon, what we're going to do is give you sort of an overview of the budget outlook heading into the legislative session. Focus will be on the general fund, of course, as well as the Transportation Trust Fund and the capital budget outlook in terms of debt service and affordability. I think the kind of overarching takeaway from today's meeting is that there's an enormous gap between the ongoing spending commitments the state has made and the ongoing revenues. By fiscal 2030, the final year of our forecast that we'll be presenting, we're showing the state only having enough revenue to cover 84% of the expenses that we're projecting the state to incur. That is the largest gap that we have seen in the last 20 years. It is a more significant gap than we saw during the Great Recession. So this is a significant challenge. It's the result of spending growth growing about 6% a year over the next 5 years, while revenues are projected to grow only 3% a year. And that reflects that we've been in a relatively stagnant period in terms of the Maryland economy. We're growing, but very, very slowly. We have not seen a lot of employment growth. We do have very low unemployment, but just not seeing much employment growth, and that's depressing our revenues a little bit. On the spending side, the General Assembly has made a number of commitments in recent years, most notably the K through 12 enhancements, or known as the blueprint, that continue to be rolled out, and they drive a lot of the growth in costs throughout the next 5 years. We are also seeing, at the same time, growth in Medicaid. We've seen much higher than expected costs in Medicaid in the current year and in fiscal 24. We're also seeing a great deal of growth in demand for the state's child care subsidy program, which has grown at an enormous rate over the last couple of years. So all those additional spending pressures are leading to spending growing much faster than the revenues. And then you overlay that with the results of the election, which present concerns for Maryland's economy, as there's been much discussion about reductions in the federal workforce or relocation of federal agencies outside of the greater Washington region, which obviously would be harmful to the Maryland economy. And there's also the risk of some level of federal cutbacks in aid going to state and local governments, which again will present challenges to the state of Maryland. We take in about $19 billion of federal funding in our state budget each year. So with that overview, I'm going to turn it over to Teresa Jasinski, who's going to talk to you about the economy and the general fund revenue outlook.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Romans, for your overview. And also, we'd like to add that we also have the Chair of Senate Budget and Tax with us, Senator Guy Gazzoni, and also the Senate President Bill Ferguson joining us today. Thank you very much, Ms. Jasinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're going to start with the economy. And the very first chart here is an overview of the Maryland economic performance in calendar 2024. And what we're showing you here outside of the unemployment rate is the percent change for each of these variables over the same month in 2023. And we're going to start on the left side with employment. Total payroll employment growth. Payroll employment means these numbers do not include the self-employed. We have data through the first 9 months of the year, and you can see total employment year to date is up 0.2% in Maryland. That's about 5,800 jobs. And Maryland ranks 50th in the country in job growth, with only Oregon growing slower. Compared to our neighbors, the District of Columbia is up about 0.6%, and Virginia is up 1.7%. The second column is private sector employment growth. That means I've taken out state, local, and federal government employment. And you can see that is actually negative. According to the data, we have actually lost private sector jobs, 0.3% year to date. That's about 5,900 jobs. This is not one or two industries pulling the total down. It's actually pretty broad-based. As the data is currently reported, there are very few industries that are growing at all. One is big and very important, and that's the healthcare sector, but other growth is in a few small areas. You'll also notice that if you look at the monthly numbers, every single month for the first 7 months of the year are down below year-ago levels. And although the declines aren't very big, seeing any decline, let alone month after month of decline, is just unheard of in the history outside of a recession. And the US economy and the Maryland economy are clearly not in recession. And we're going to talk about this private sector employment data a little bit more on the next page. The unemployment rate has risen over the course of the year. It started at 2.3%, and as of September, it was at 2.9%. It is still very low by historical standards. Anything under 3% is pretty low by historical standards, but it has risen. And so it may not be surprising to see that initial claims for unemployment insurance are up 7.6% year to date. But the level of claims in 2024 is actually quite consistent with the level of claims in 2019, the last year before the pandemic. And in 2019, private sector job growth was 0.8%. So the level of claims is not consistent with a situation where we are losing private sector jobs. Also on this table, we have some other areas of the economy, vehicle sales. Those are up zero. They're actually down slightly, I'm sorry, year to date. We only have data though through the month of July. The housing market kind of continues the way it's been going for the last several years. Existing home sales continue to fall. High mortgage rates are obviously continuing to weigh on the home market. The median price continues to rise. This is largely due to a very limited number of homes for sale, and that has been the story for the last couple of years. So if we can go to the next chart and go back to this question of declining private sector job growth, what I've done here is graph the data from the first page. That's the blue bar on this graph, but I've taken it back to January of 2023. And if you focus on the blue bars, and again, this is year-over-year percent change, private sector payroll employment in Maryland. In 2023, we actually saw some pretty robust growth, especially in the first half of the year. Some of this is continuing bounce back from the pandemic. But growth slowed considerably in the second half of the year. And as we move into 2024, you see those 7 months of declines. Now, the blue bar, this data that we've been talking about, this comes from something called the Current Establishment Survey. It's a monthly survey of businesses. The abbreviation here is CES, Current Establishment Survey. It's a monthly survey of businesses. And as a survey, it is subject to sampling error. They do issue revisions. Usually each month, they will revise the prior month or two. And then there's a major revision each year in March, known as the benchmark revision. And the benchmark revision, the basis for that largely is an alternate measure of employment, known as the Quarterly Census of Employment and Wages, or the QCEW. And that is shown on this graph by the red line. The quarterly census, as the name implies, is the census and not a survey. It's not subject to sampling error. And it's considered really the best data we have on employment. It is, however, quarterly. So it only comes out every quarter, and it comes out with about a 6-month lag. So we only have data for 2024 through the month of March. And we will get the second quarter data through June at the beginning of December. But if you look at 2023, the red line is above the blue bar every single month, meaning it's growing faster. And rather than decelerating at the end of the year, it actually accelerated. And the box here in the upper right-hand corner shows you the actual quarterly growth rates. For all of 2023, private sector employment under the CES data grew 0.8%, and Maryland ranked 50th among the states. But using the QCEW data, it grew twice as fast, 1.6%, and Maryland ranked 39th. Now, as we move into 2024, there is a slowdown here in employment growth. You look at the red line and see how it comes down considerably as we move into 2024. And you look at the box, you can see the growth rate comes down from 1.5% to 0.4% in the first quarter. But importantly, it does not go negative. We are not losing private sector jobs. It does end in March. We don't know what happens after March. But it doesn't seem to be the case at all that we're losing private sector jobs and that there's something off about the monthly payroll data that we've been getting. I will say that this slowdown in growth between the end of 23 and the beginning of 24 is not unique to Maryland. Almost every single state has seen the exact same thing, as has the U.S. government. The U.S. economy as a whole. That 0.4% growth in the first quarter for Maryland equates to a rank of 39 among all the states. So it's pretty common to have seen this. So the bottom line here is this decline in private sector employment seems to simply not be happening. There's something wrong with the data. On the other hand, it is important to keep in mind that employment growth has slowed. And as 2024 began, it was well below 1% growth. So if we go to the next chart, we'll move on to the economic forecast. In September, the Board of Revenue Estimates put together a new economic forecast. This chart compares it to their previous forecast in March. The BRE has been dealing with these data issues all year. We've had other issues that I won't get into with big revisions to wage and salary income data. And so they've tried to take a measured approach and look through all this noise. And as a result, their economic forecast really has not changed a whole lot since March. They have lowered their estimate of employment growth for 2024 from 0.7% to 0.4%, but their forecast of income is not all that different. You'll notice that employment growth slows going forward to as little as 0.1% out in 2027. That was true back in March. This is not a recession. This is just the effect of demographics. We have a slow-growing population in this state, an aging population. So we have very low labor force growth, and that is a constraint on employment growth. One of the things that has changed is their forecast of capital gains income in the lower right corner. It's important to note with this data that the last year of actuals is 2021. So both 2022 and 2023 are estimates for both March and the September forecast. And what they have done is flip from a negative, small negative for 2023 through 2025 to a small positive, reflecting the fact that the stock market has been quite strong. It was strong last year. It's very strong this year. And so the odds of a decline are limited. However, you can get into a lot of trouble with your revenue forecast if you overestimate capital gains income. And so they're taking a measured approach, a conservative approach, recognizing a decline is unlikely, but they don't want to go too far out on the limb and expect big increases here because it can come back to bite you pretty badly. So before we move on to the revenue forecast, I do want to, on the next page, just remind us all of how important the federal government is to the Maryland economy. If we could move to the next page, there we go. As Dave Romans mentioned at the top, with the new administration, there could be significant changes that impact the federal workforce as well as federal spending. And so there's a couple bullet points here just to put some context on this. We do have about 160,000 civilian federal jobs located in the state. That includes about 12,000 in the Postal Service. It does not include people at the National Security Agency, which is because it is a classified agency, their job counts are also classified. Even outside of the NSA, we do have a fair amount of jobs in the national security area, but we also have about 40,000 jobs in the state in the Department of Health and Human Services, most of them in H and also in the Food and Drug Administration. And of course, it's not just about the jobs that are actually in Maryland. We know lots of Marylanders commute to neighboring jurisdictions to work for the federal government. Both Virginia and the district also have each about 190,000 federal jobs. And then there's also the question of federal spending, not only federal spending that might hit the state's budget, but also federal contract spending. In federal fiscal year 2023, that was about $42 billion in Maryland. That equates to about 10% of private sector gross state product. And about a little bit less than half of that comes from the Defense Department. So this is just, we obviously don't know what is going to happen here as we go forward, but just a reminder of its importance. And also keep in mind that, as Dave said at the beginning, we don't have a very strong growth in our economy. We don't have a lot of cushion to absorb any major cutbacks in either the federal workforce or federal contract spending. And if we move on now to the revenues, we're going to start with the fiscal 2024 closeout. So this table compares the fiscal 2024 actual revenues to the estimate and also to fiscal 2023. In total, general fund revenues exceeded the estimate by $217 million and grew 5%. If we exclude one-time transfers from both years, ongoing growth was 1%. By far the largest source of general fund revenues is the personal income tax. That missed the estimate just slightly by $80 million and grew 1.1%. That was more than offset by overattainment in the corporate income tax, which was over by $131 million. We continue to see strong growth in gross receipts. Corporate refunds were up 10%, but they were lower than the BRE's estimate and continue to be low by historical standards. The corporate income tax for the general fund grew 4.8%. And I will point out that between the 2 years, the amount of the corporate income tax going to the Transportation Trust Fund did increase, and yet general fund growth was still 4.8%. The sales and use tax, that missed the estimate just by a little. It fell 1.8%. There was an increase in the share going to the Blueprint Fund between 2023 and 2024. Sales tax gross receipts were 0.8% in 24 over fiscal 23, but 2024 included cannabis for the first time. And in cannabis revenues, the gross receipts was about $63 million. The general fund was about 30 of that. If we exclude cannabis revenues to be a little bit more apples to apples between the 2 years, gross receipts and the sales tax actually fell 0.2%. So we continue to see extremely low, if no growth in the sales tax, and that is our second largest general fund revenue source. Among the other revenues, there was significant overattainment in interest on investment and the insurance premium tax. There was a fair amount of overattainment in miscellaneous revenues, although much of it was of a one-time nature. On the downside, we were under the estimate for the alcohol and tobacco taxes and the estate and the inheritance taxes. If we move on to the general fund forecast, as you're aware, in September, the Board of Revenue Estimates issued a new general fund revenue forecast, and this table is comparing their fiscal 2025 estimate from September to their previous estimate in March, and you'll also see the first official estimate for fiscal 2026. In total, the BRE raised their general fund estimate in 2025 by $88 million, expecting growth of 0.8%. Ongoing growth is at 1.4%. That ongoing growth increases to 2.1% in fiscal 2026 before you apply the volatility adjustment. The 2024 Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act, the BRFA, did eliminate the volatility adjustment in fiscal 2025. You'll notice some big year-over-year changes. The tobacco tax in 2026 falls 22%. That 2024 BRFA also increased the state tobacco taxes and added a new distribution to the Blueprint Fund. In 2025, that distribution is $88 million, meant to equate to the extra revenue raised by those tax increases. But in 2026, the distribution is 32.6% of total tobacco tax revenues. And so the distribution increases from 88 million in 2025 to about 151 million in 2026. You'll also notice big drops in general fund lottery revenues, almost 19% in fiscal 25 and another 9% in fiscal 26. The BRE is expecting net lottery sales to fall in 2025. There were 7 separate billion-dollar-plus draws between Mega Millions and Powerball in fiscal 2024. They're not expecting that to continue. And as of right now, we have yet to see even $1 billion jackpot in 2025. And they're also expecting like a slight decline in net sales in 26. But the bigger thing that's going on with the lottery is a sharp increase in special fund lottery distributions. So money going from rather to the general fund to various special funds. And that is illustrated on the next page in a graph. If we can go to the next page. Here we go. So what this graph shows you is the special fund lottery distributions for fiscal 24, 25, and 26. And in total, those distributions are going to increase from about 45 million in fiscal 24 to 148 million in fiscal 25 and 187 million in fiscal 2026. And the bulk of that is coming from efforts to redevelop the football and baseball stadiums in Baltimore. That's the red bar on this graph. In 2024, that's $15 million, but that $15 million is actually towards debt service on the bonds from the original development of Camden Yards and the Arabian Stadium, which we are still paying. That debt service cost is expected to finally wind down in 2030, fiscal 2030. In fiscal 2025, we had about $35 million for the redevelopment of the football stadium. And then on top of that, in fiscal 26, we add another $40 million for the baseball stadium. In 2025, we begin 2 $27 million distributions, one to the Bus Rapid Transit Fund in the Maryland Department of Transportation, and the other to a program again, run through the Stadium Authority to develop facilities in the Blue Line Corridor area of Prince George's County. The Stadium Authority also does school construction in Baltimore City. That's a program that's been going on since fiscal 2016. That's $20 million a year. And the Stadium Authority has taken on a new program to develop non-major league sports facilities and other entertainment facilities. And that is expected to cost about $20 million a year. And then there's a variety of other smaller distributions, the full list of which is in Appendix 6 on page 46 if you are interested. And that concludes my presentation.
Great. Thank you very much, Ms. Tuzinski, for your presentation. This afternoon, we also have joining us the Speaker of the House, Speaker Adrian Jones. Thank you very much for being here. Next, we'll move on to the fiscal 2026 baseline forecast presented by Tanya Zimmerman.
Thank you. We're going to start here with discussion of the general fund reversions from fiscal 2024. In total, they were about $299 million. This was $166 million more than was planned during the 2024 session. However, as you can see with the blue slice on the pie chart here, $93 million or 31%, so more than half of the amount that was more than planned, were reversions in error. The largest of those is $64.3 million in the Assistance Payments Program in the Department of Human Services. That's the program where public benefits are paid. There was another $24 million of PAYGO funding from the Board of Public Works, PAYGO from prior years, and then another $4 million from prior years related to the Howard Street Tunnel, and then a smaller amount from the Department of Housing and Community Development. There are a couple other areas that we're monitoring that were potentially in error, but we're still investigating those. Of the remaining reversions, the largest of these were in the Department of Health, about $71 million. Again, a good portion of these were from prior years. It includes about $53.6 million from the Behavioral Health Administration, including over funding for fiscal 2023 bills that they had accrued to pay in fiscal 2024 that were lower than expected, as well as recouping some prior year overpayments to providers. It also includes about $2.6 million from legislative additions in fiscal 2024 that were not spent. If you turn to the next page, this begins the look at kind of the baseline forecast, starting with the fiscal 2025 anticipated deficiency appropriations. In total, we've estimated deficiency appropriations totaling $1.3 billion. Most of these are general funds, and I'll get into a little more detail about the general funds in a moment. Special funds also increased by about $310 million. $109 million of that is from the rainy day fund to support Medicaid and foster care expenses. This was authorized in Section 31 of the fiscal 2025 budget bill. And then there's also significant increases related to the funding for the Trauma Services Fund that was part of the of legislation that was enacted in the 2024 session to support those programs, and the Department of Transportation that you'll hear a little bit more about. If you turn to the next slide. So this is a look more at the general fund deficiency appropriations, which total over $1 billion. There's about $283 million that we've estimated that are related to fiscal 2024 bills for which there was insufficient appropriation. The largest of these, about $214 million, is in the Medicaid program. There was about another $48 million in the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services, primarily for the inmate medical contract. And then there is an additional about $26 million in the Department of Human Services for the foster care maintenance payments program and the assistance payments program, and about $8 million for non-public placements. Moving on to kind of the other expenses aside from those fiscal 2024, the actual fiscal 2025 costs. The largest of these is also, again, in Medicaid. It's about $392 million across both the regular Medicaid program and the behavioral health for those Medicaid eligible recipients. And then $155 million for the child care scholarship. The inmate medical contract, the costs weren't known. The contracts hadn't been awarded at the time of the budget. So the new inmate medical contract is expected to cost about $107 million more than was budgeted. If you turn to the next slide. So this begins to look at the fiscal 2026 expenditures. So general fund spending in fiscal 2026 in our forecast would increase by $1.26 billion. So there's about 511 million of that is related to entitlements. Again, Medicaid is the biggest portion of that, including the behavioral health related costs. Those combined to be about $459 million. And there's an additional about $35 million for the foster care maintenance payments program and $17 million for the assistance payments program. The reserve fund increases by about $469 million. This is the $50 million for the pension sweeper, as well as the other post-employment benefits sweeper that were not funded in the fiscal 2025 budget, but are mandated, and so are shown in 26. And the remainder of that is the required distribution from to the appropriation to the rainy day fund. In local aid, there's about a $219 million increase that's really driven by the retirement costs for the teachers, library, and the community colleges, which makes up about $177 million of that increase. If you turn to the next slide, this focuses in on the portion of the increase that is related to kind of state agency changes. The first two bars are the related to kind of the compensation and personnel related costs. $172 million of that increase is related to an assumed 2% cost of living adjustment, as well as increments, including the annualization of some fiscal 2025 increments, primarily the service year increment, which is provided mid-year. There's about $110 million that's related to pension and health insurance costs. About 83 million of that is related to health insurance. The major IT fund increases by about 155 million, primarily based on what was planned in the 2026 session, or 2024 session, sorry. The inmate medical contract, the child care scholarship would increase by about another $103 million beyond the anticipated deficiency appropriation. There's about $48 million that are restorations of some of the one-time cost containment, some of the cost containment actions that were one-time. Those include mandated funding, as well as some delays in hiring and operational costs that are really only one-time actions. These are partially offset by a few small changes, including one-time legislative additions and the one-time funding to support the operating budget of WMATA. So as you can see here, it's not really just kind of one thing. There are just a lot of different things driving up costs among state agencies. And that concludes my presentation, and Dave Romans will be next.
Great. Thank you very much, Mrs. Zimmerman. Mr. Romans for the general fund outlook.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's go on to the next. Yeah, here we are. So this slide just pulls together the numbers that Teresa talked about on the revenue side with the spending numbers that Tanya just talked about. And I would call your attention to the little box in the center of the page. It shows cash balance. So in fiscal 24, the year that ended in June, we ended with a balance of about $1 billion. Our fiscal 25 forecast with all those deficiencies that Tanya went through has us a short of about $300 million. So there's going to need to be some actions taken in fiscal 25 to address that. And then in fiscal 26, we're projecting a $2.7 billion budget shortfall, with revenues only covering about 92% of ongoing spending. It is worth noting on this slide that we've left $2.5 billion in the rainy day fund in fiscal 26. That's equal to 10% of general fund revenues. So there is some cash available that could be used to help mitigate some of the near-term challenge. Let's go to the next slide, please. So one of the questions I've been asked a bit is, well, why do things get so much worse going from fiscal 25, where we saw the roughly 300 million shortfall, to over a $2 billion problem in 26? And we showed sort of the three major things that are changing. The blue, which is a positive number, is ongoing revenues, as Teresa talked about, are growing a little bit, about 249 million more revenue in fiscal 26 than in 25. But in fiscal 25, we relied a lot on one-time revenues from fund balance and transfers from the rainy day fund and other funds. So we spent about 1.4 billion of one-time money that will not be available in fiscal 26. At the same time, as Tanya showed you, spending is growing in fiscal 26 by our forecast, growing by about 1.3 billion. So it's that combination of less one-time money being available and significant growth in spending that's causing the significant turnaround from 25 to 26. Let's go to the next slide, please. All right, so now we shift gears and look at the general fund budget outlook through fiscal 30. This is our 5-year forecast of spending and revenues. The blue bars are the cash basis. The line is the structural. In other words, does your ongoing revenues cover your ongoing spending? And you can see the line, they're showing a very similar picture. We'd already talked about 25 and 26. Fiscal 27 looks a lot like 26, with about a 2.7 billion cash shortfall forecasted. And then there's this big jump in the challenge, starting in 28 and continuing to grow through fiscal 30. And that jump is driven largely by the blueprint costs. As you'll see in a couple of minutes, the Blueprint Fund, which is a special fund that a lot of revenues are deposited into, has been able to support Blueprint costs and will continue to do so through fiscal 27. By fiscal 28, however, the revenues in the Blueprint Fund are not enough to cover all the growing Blueprint implementation costs, and that's what results in a big jump in the deficit, as the general fund has to start covering the rest of those costs. The other thing I would note is on the structural basis, by fiscal 2030, our ongoing revenues cover only 84% of our ongoing spending. As I mentioned at the start, that is the worst situation we've seen in the last 20 years and is worse than the Great Recession. And the next graphic shows that. So let's go on to that. Yeah, so this shows our spending affordability forecast over each of the last 20 years. So, the pre-session forecast, and it shows what share of the projected costs in the final year of our forecast that year could be covered by ongoing revenues. As you can see, we have frequently forecasted a structural shortfall going into the session. It's usually, though, in the mid-90, revenues can cover 94, 93% of the cost. We've had some good years as recently as 2022, where we actually had more than enough revenue to cover our ongoing costs. But you can see with the three red bars, those are the years where our out-year forecast showed a really significant gap between the ongoing revenues and ongoing spending. And our forecast for this that we're presenting now is by far the worst at 84%, even worse in those Great Recession years, 2008 and 2009, when we were at the 87, 89% level. Let's go to the next slide. So what we're trying to show you here is what's driving the spending. And we broke it into sort of two segments, the spending growth from 25 to 27, and then the spending growth from 27 to 30. And we broke it up because, as you can see, there's some similarities between the two periods. In both periods, see significant growth in entitlement spending, employee salary and benefits, as we've built in COLAs and employee increments each year of our forecast, and state agencies, just regular costs, as well as implementing mandates and other legislation, continues to drive costs in both periods. But the really dramatic difference, and what's so much more challenging about those more distant years, is the education aid grows so much because, as I said, the Blueprint Fund is unable to cover all the education aid costs in statute. Let's look at the next slide. This just pulls together the whole period. It shows you where the spending growth is in 2030 compared to 2025. So over the 5 years, where is the spending growth? And you can see about 41% of that general fund growth is education aid. And then entitlements are about 20%, and employee salaries are about 14%. So those three things make out about 75% of the spending growth. And this illustrates the challenges that the governor and the General Assembly face in trying to deal with this budget deficit, as these are all areas that have been high priorities for both the governor and the General Assembly in recent years. Let's go to the next slide. All right, this just shows you the blueprint fund. So the stacked bars add up to the blueprint implementation costs in each of these years, fiscal 24 through fiscal 30. And then the different colors show you how we paid for those costs. So the dark blue bar is the ongoing revenues to the blueprint fund. So casino revenues and some other revenues that go into the blueprint fund are covering a substantial portion of the costs in fiscal 24 and 25, and even in our 26 forecast. However, they can't cover all the implementation costs in those years, and the rest is being covered with the kind of greenish color, which is the fund balance. The blueprint fund had built up a large fund balance going into the implementation, knowing that we were going to have growing costs. And that fund balance is being used to cover costs, and it really gets us through fiscal 27 without needing to look to the general fund for really any assistance. But then, as that black line shows you, the fund balance in the blueprint fund at the end of fiscal 27 is zero. So after 27, we only have ongoing blueprint revenues, the new revenues that come in each year to support the blueprint costs, and they are lacking, and they don't come anywhere near covering all of the planned expenses. And that's where the yellow bars, the general fund, comes in. And you can see that's what's really driving that longer term budget challenges. We're putting $2 billion in 28 in general funds into K through 12 education and over $3 billion in 2030. And those costs will continue to grow until 2034 under the blueprint implementation schedule. So if we ran this out, you would see continuing growth in that general fund support in subsequent years. All right, let's go to the next slide. All right, this is the last slide on sort of the big picture outlook. What we're trying to illustrate for you here is there are some things that you've done in the past that are relatively easy using cash to help address the short-term problem. And there's three components. The green is using some of the rainy day fund. As I mentioned, we have about $2.5 billion in the rainy day fund under our forecast in fiscal 26. If you spent half of that, you came down from 10% of revenues in the rainy day fund to 5%, that would give you a little over $1.2 billion to spend, which would help you with dealing with the 25 and some of the 26 problem. A second action that you can take that would be significant help is to suspend the revenue volatility provision. So instead of setting aside a little bit of our revenue as sort of a hedge, you could spend all of that revenue. And again, that helps make $300 million in 26, $167 million in 27. The third component of a possible kind of cash solution is that the state has done a lot of PAYGO capital in the last few years. And what PAYGO is using cash, general fund cash, to support capital projects. Now, not all that money has actually been spent yet, as capital projects take a long time to be roll out. So you could take that money back, take say $250 million of general funds back, and instead bond those costs. So the projects would still get funded, but you use bonds rather than the cash. So if you did those three things, you can get through fiscal 25 without any really difficult decisions. And you solve roughly half of the fiscal 26 problem. But you still have the red bar part, which is the unsolved part. And I think there's a couple of takeaways from this chart. One is doing those more easy to do, so to speak, things don't solve your problem. You still have an enormous problem in 26, and it grows dramatically by 28. So this needs to be significant long-term solutions, whether they are spending reductions, revenue increases, or both, to address the problem. You're not going to be able to just use the cash resources the state has to manage our way out of the problem. The other takeaway I want you to have from this chart is it's easy to say, let's use the rainy day fund, let's get rid of the revenue volatility. But remember, this budget problem is not being driven by a recession. It's being driven by a somewhat stagnant economy and by our spending ambitions. So if you use the rainy day fund and you get rid of the revenue volatility, you're eliminating two of the things that you sort of can rely on during recession to help mitigate the impacts of a recession. So I would be cautious in using these strategies without having a longer term plan to solve the budget problem, because if we were to fall into a recession in the next few years, you'd have very few options left to deal with it other than making substantial cuts. Mr. Chairman, that's the end of the general fund outlook. The next section is on the transportation trust fund.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Romans. Next, with the Transportation Trust Fund presented by Steve McCullough.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On this first page, we are showing the new revenues that the General Assembly passed last session to benefit the Transportation Trust Fund. And this shows that over the 6-year forecast, draft forecast, that's expected to bring in nearly $2 billion to the trust fund. Next page, please. This page then compares the January 2024 forecast for the trust fund, which is the first column of numbers, with the Maryland Department of Transportation, or MDOT's, September draft forecast that came out 2 months ago. And as you can see, total revenues are up in the draft forecast by $2.4 billion. And spending, you'll see in the middle section, shows how that is spent. The majority of the new revenues are being devoted to the operating expenses for the department. This is funding many of the same things you saw on the general fund side with the compensation. But there are also a number of large contracts, things for like paratransit, line access charge contracts for the MARC system that are really beyond MDOT's ability to control. And so that has put pressure on the operating budget. Then on the bottom section shows the capital summary. And it's, again, comparing those first two columns of numbers. The third column shows the difference. You can see that the total capital program over the 6 years in the draft forecast is $1.3 billion less than the forecast that came out last January. The biggest driver of that decrease, you can see, is the federal fund support for the capital program goes down by nearly $1.5 billion. The reason for that, in the January 2024 forecast, MDOT assumed a very aggressive pull down of federal funds. And the overall program assumptions was that federal funds would cover about 80% of the capital program, with the state picking up the rest, the other 20. This was a departure from previous CTPs, or consolidated transportation programs, where there was a 70-30 split federal to state funding. So MDOT was trying to pull down as many federal funds as it could, but it's discovered soon after the fiscal year began that that's harder to do than they expected. It requires a lot of work to start pulling down federal funds for programs that hadn't been done previously. Things like inspections and inventories have to be done before those types of funding for programs are eligible for federal funds. And therefore, in the September draft, MDOT dialed that back a bit, and the draft CTP assumes a 75-25 federal state split. So still more than prior to the January 2024 level, but not as strong as the January 2024 level of federal funds. The final column then is of 2 columns of numbers, is the DLS November forecast. DLS does its own forecast of the motor fuel tax, titling tax revenues, and then also the spending side, the baseline assumptions for the department. And you can see that DLS has about $360 million more in revenues assumed over this period. Now, that does include for fiscal 25 and 26 consensus numbers that DLS and the Department of Transportation and the BRE all get together and agree on motor fuel and titling taxes. So that includes that. But then the rest of the year shows that we've got about $360 million more in revenues, which falls to the capital program because the spending side, operating budget, we're very close to the MDOT revenues. So in total, capital program under the DLS would be $348 million more than in the MDOT forecast. One thing to note is that under the revenue line, DLS is assuming the same amount of bond issuance to support the capital program as shown in the MDOT September forecast. The reason that the additional revenues do not translate into additional bond issuances is that in both the MDOT and the DLS forecasts, in the final 2 years of the forecast period, the debt service coverage ratios fall below the 2.5 times net income to debt service that that MDOT keeps as an administrative minimum. And in fact, in 2030, it falls close to the 2.0 times net income level that is the bare minimum under the bond covenants the department has with its bondholders, after which, if they breach that 2.0 level and go below that, they are not allowed to issue any more debt until those revenues or that ratio climbs above 2.0. Next slide, please. And we can skip that. That was mostly what I just talked about. Next slide. So this shows the Consolidated Transportation Program and compares the 2024 January with final CTP with the draft that came out in September. The top chart shows how the funding is by mode. You can see that the State Highway Administration has the largest decrease between those two forecasts, which is understandable since it is the largest capital program for the department. Transit Administration and the Washington Metro Area Transit Authority both see slight increases. The rest of the modes also show either flat or slight declines in that. The bottom chart on that page shows the same decrease. This, in both instances, it's that $1.3 billion decrease over the 6 years. Shows it by category of spending, and you can see that the system preservation funding is the largest decrease in that area. Next slide, please. This is the final slide for transportation. The Spending Affordability Committee is tasked by statute with making 2 recommendations with regard to the Transportation Trust Fund and Capital Program. The first recommendation is what the minimum level of fund balance should be in the budget year for the trust fund. And the second is to recommend a minimum expenditure for system preservation for the Department of Transportation. In terms of the ending fund balance, the fiscal 2026 ending fund balance in MDOT's forecast is $400 million. This level is needed to provide cash flow, especially given the size of the federal fund program. Many of those federal dollars are received only on a reimbursement basis after the state has put out the funds in advance. So $400 million seems appropriate for that. In terms of system preservation, the chart in the middle of that page shows the 10-year average spending for system preservation. And you can see that the estimate in 2026 in the draft is just slightly less than the 10-year average spending, which has been the level of recommendation that the Spending Affordability Committee has made the past few years. So it is $19 million short of that 10-year average. And that concludes my presentation.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. McCullough. Next, we'll have the state debt policy and capital program presented by Patrick Frank and Emily Haskell.
Hello, yeah, state debt begins here on page 26. The first exhibit shows you what our estimated ratios, affordability ratios are over the forecast period. We calculate this regularly. The standard is that debt service to revenues not exceed 8% of revenues, and debt outstanding not exceed 4% of personal income. The state is well under the affordability ratios. DLS notes that what we're using is this committee's recommendation from last year, which is that the 2025 program, which was $1.75 billion, increased by 2% or $35 billion to $1.785 billion. What the Capital Debt Affordability Committee recommended is a $1.75 billion recommendation again in fiscal 2026. The difference between those two numbers in the affordability ratios is very small, less than 0.03%. In the out years, though, the difference would be quite a bit bigger. DLS estimates that when fully phased in, $35 billion is about $3.7 billion of annual debt service, and altogether, the increases would bring about $18.7 billion of debt service on an annual basis. Next slide. One issue that was raised earlier is the structural deficit that we have and the problem in 2025. One of the possibilities is to issue $250 million of bonds for $250 million of payable projects. In other words, moving them from the operating spending revenues to the capital program. This would cost, once fully phased in, about $26.4 million a year. The chart shows that we anticipate that this would get phased in fairly quickly because these are projects that have already been approved, and so we anticipate that we would need the cash flow sooner, and that's why we get to that number more quickly. It does add to the debt service to revenues and the debt outstanding to personal income amounts. Since the debt is fixed, what you see is you peak pretty early in that, and then it drops a little bit. So it's about 9 basis points, or 0.09%, and about 0.04% is what the effect is on our ratios. Next slide. One issue that Maryland has to always consider is that we are a high debt state. What this table here shows is all of the states that are rated AAA by all 3 rating agencies. And the numbers represent the ratings from 1 to 50, with 1 being the highest debt levels or highest liabilities, and 50 being the lowest. As you can see in the gray is where Maryland is, and what I've done is all states that have higher ratios than Maryland have also graded. So you can say in most categories, like total long-term liabilities, implied debt service is the annual debt service that we pay, the pension, the unfunded pension liability, and capital depreciation is highest among all the states. One thing I'll point out too on that is that when Moody's does this, they do try to compare, make the comparisons as fair as possible. And one thing they do, for instance, in implied debt service, they recalculate debt service so that all states are on it amortized over 20 years, and they use the same discount rate for pension and OPEB liability so that there's comparability among the states. Next slide. And the final slide in the debt service part has to do with the outlook of Maryland's debt. Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and Fitch all rated Maryland debt AAA in June of this year. However, Moody's gave Maryland a negative outlook instead of this normal standard outlook that we've gotten in recent years. There's a couple of reasons, or a couple of factors I think we should consider on this. First of all, Moody's concern has to do with the kinds of things that we're talking about today, and that is that we've got a large structural deficit looming, and the reserves could be run down pretty quickly, and that would make for a very difficult budget situation. Also, what's happening now too is that the rating agencies, especially Moody's and Standard & Poor's, are revising their methodologies to be more quantitative, so that the numbers that they're able to find in annual reports and things like that are a larger share of their rating. And as I mentioned in the last slide, Maryland is a high debt state, so we have some challenges there. Also, they did say that if we're able to resolve the problems, and that's really what they're looking for is resolving our structural deficit. And a final point I'd like to make is that Moody's also considers certain liabilities that we have to be state debt that our capital debt affordability committee doesn't. A key one of this is for the Baltimore City school bonds, for instance, and the Built to Learn bonds. They are counting them as state debt. And we are not. There are some transportation projects as well. And so that's kind of a quick update on what the last rating agency report gave to us. And as you can see in it, the total debt outstanding would increase from 13.7 billion by our calculation to 18.3 billion, still under the ratios, but it is much closer to our ratios. And that concludes my remarks.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Frank, for your presentation. And next we'll have personnel pensions presented by Jacob Cash and Michael Rubenstein.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I still have some remarks on the capital program.
Excuse me, Ms. Haskell, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this chart looks at the use of PAYGO general funds to support the capital program over time, following the historically high levels of PAYGO that we saw in fiscal 23 and 24, and even back to fiscal 22. Very little PAYGO was used in fiscal 25, and almost no general funds are planned for fiscal 2026, with low levels continuing throughout the planning period. You can also see that although the capital program is expected to be smaller overall compared to the historic highs of fiscal 23 and 2024, the capital program will still be quite a bit bigger than it had been in prior years. Next slide, please. So this looks at fiscal 2026 only. Capital commitments total about $1.9 billion, which is a little more than $100 million above last year's Spending Affordability Committee recommended authorization level of $1.785 billion. The light blue bars reflect items that are accounted for using general funds in our baseline assumptions. These include $24 million in deficiencies that you heard about earlier to replace funds that were accidentally reverted during fiscal 2024 closeout. And there's also $6.2 million for a new mandate supporting Bowie Racecourse, and also $5 million to replace PAYGO funds for the demolition of State Center that were reduced by the Board of Public Works this summer. Other commitments include $47 million needed for school construction above what was planned in the capital improvement program to meet the statutory goal of providing $450 million annually for school construction. And then there were also $74 million in pre-authorizations that were added by the General Assembly last session. There are some sources of additional funding that are available to fund some of these commitments. That comes from $9 million in fiscal responsibility funds that can be used for education, as well as $5 million in bond premium from the bond sale this past June. Next slide. Switching gears a little bit, this shows the decline in transfer tax revenues that are available to support both operating and capital programs. As you can see, the funding available in fiscal 25 and 26 is well below the fiscal 2024 level. This is due both to lower projected revenues going forward and also to negative adjustments due to underattainment of actual revenues. In fiscal 2026, transfer tax revenues are estimated to be insufficient to fully fund park service operations. As a result, the baseline assumed $21 million in general funds will be needed to backfill for the insufficient transfer tax revenues. And that concludes what I have in the capital program.
Thank you, Ms. Haskell. Next, we'll have personnel pensions presented by Jacob Cash and Michael Rubenstein.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This chart on page 33 shows executive branch filled positions from the beginning of the year in each quarter. They were increasing up until July, and they peaked in July, as well as the lowest point for vacancy rates, as have been some progress the administration has been making. However, we see in October that the filled positions have decreased and vacancy rates have increased again. We can go to the next slide. So this shows those vacancies compared by department against the budgeted rates. So the budgeted turnover rate on average was 8% across agencies. And currently in October, that vacancy rate is 10.4%. So there is potential for vacancy savings this fiscal year if trends continue. And we see most of those vacancies are building up in the Department of Health. Next slide. As part of our forecast, we also assume salary increases. We're assuming a 2% general salary increase in 2026, as well as one-step increment, which is about 2.4%. And as you can see, since 2019, there have been substantial general salary increases totaling 24%, and those step increases moving people up the salary scale for about 12% of a salary increase. So there have been substantial increases, and we are assuming that this standard rate of about 2% COLA and 2.4% step increases will continue in the forecasted years. That concludes my remarks.
Great,
Okay,
thank you. Mr. Rubenstein?
yes. Turning to the next page, looking at the projected state employer contributions for pensions. If you look at the total state line in the exhibit, the state's fiscal 2026 employer contributions for the state retirement and pension system are projected to increase by 16.8% over fiscal 25, or roughly $369 million. The state had been on about a 10-year run of pension contributions growing in the very sustainable range of 3 to 6% annually. That ended last year when contributions grew by about 19%. The reasons for the large increase this year are essentially the same as last year. First, payroll growth, especially in the teachers' plan, but also among employees, as Jacob just discussed, has far exceeded assumed levels. This can largely be attributed to both salary increases and the expansion of personnel under the blueprint and in state government. Second, inflation, though lower this year than last year, is still running higher than assumed, which affects the COLAs paid to retirees. And finally, although the pension system's investment returns for fiscal 24 slightly exceeded the 6.8% targeted rate of return, the return has not met that target in 3 of the last 5 years. As a result, the 5-year smooth rate of return used to calculate the contribution rates is causing upward pressure on those rates. Employer contributions for local boards of education are also expected to grow by 10.2% or $41 million. Their contributions are also affected by inflation and payroll growth, but not by the investment underperformance, as the state is responsible for covering all unfunded liabilities. Finally, on the next page, there's an item there that talks about the system still has about $2.4 billion in unrecognized losses that, barring strong returns in the next 2 years, will continue to exert upward pressure on contribution rates for the next 4 years, especially in fiscal 2028. And that concludes my remarks.
Great. Thank you very much, Mr. Rubenstein, and thank you to the entire Department of Legislative Services for their presentations. We'll take questions now, and then the questions will be answered by the appropriate Department of Legislative Service staff. Are there any questions regarding the presentation? If there are any questions, you could raise the raise hand bar. Delegate Solomon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the DLS team for an incredibly thorough presentation, as always. I had one quick question, and one I think may require a little bit longer of an answer. But the quick question was, I think somebody had mentioned the elevated special ed costs. Was just sort of curious if you get into that a little bit more. And then the second, probably broader question, and I don't know if there's a good answer to this, is obviously the immigration policies that are potentially being proposed by the incoming administration, particularly in my community, I think are already starting to have an impact on families' policies. Just curious if there's been any analysis on what potentially that could do to the state's economy going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Delegate Solomon. If anybody wanted to answer that from Department of Legislative Services.
Because I'll just start out on the second question. I don't think we've done any sort of detailed analysis of what the immigration impact of the new administration's policies will be. We do have some data that we presented for publish each year on immigration trends and so forth in Maryland that we're certainly happy to share. I think, there's a lot of different aspects of what the new administration has proposed that will have impacts on Maryland, and some of it we're sort of waiting to see what they actually do once they come into office, and to the extent that Congress needs to act, what actually gets passed. But it's not just immigration, but across the board in terms of federal employees and some of the federal funding that comes to Maryland. Will the FBI get relocated to Maryland? Will we get the Key Bridge funded? So there's a lot of aspects that we are hesitant to put a number on right now because there's a lot to still be to see, and as they move forward.
On the first question, I think you were talking about the mention about the non-public placements. I think we're still looking into the reason for that, but part of the reason for the increase has to do with how the fiscal 2024 spending came in. It came in higher than expected. That contributed both to some of the fiscal 2024 expenses still to be paid, as well as an additional deficiency in fiscal 2025. And we're still looking into the exact reason, but it was driven by kind of the recent expenditures that we saw.
For the Senate, Senator Benson.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very much for your presentation. I need to ask two questions. I think one was just addressed. One has to do with the Key Bridge and some of the other projects that are outstanding. Are we going to do a projection as to what will happen if we have to end up by having to pay more for the Key Bridge and some of the other projects that are in place in the great state of Maryland? That's number one. Number two is for the presentations that were given this afternoon, will we have an opportunity to get a packet so that we can sit down and really internalize what has been said today?
But yes, definitely. We will make sure you get a pack. You'll get the whole document so you can review it at your leisure and think about it further. I think in the Key Bridge case, if the federal government were not to come through with much or any funding, it would put the state would obviously bear the cost, and that's the Transportation Authority. I think it would mean toll increases sooner rather than later for the various Transportation Authority places. I don't know if Steve McCulloch wants to add to that, but I think that's the major impact in the Key Bridge. I think there's also concerns about some of the longer term transit projects that have been talked about. I'll just use the Red Line in Baltimore as an example. Does the federal government cut back on transit funding or not provide that? So we'll certainly be looking into that, going into session in terms of what our risks are in terms of getting less funding. But there's definitely going to be a risk of less federal support, and then that may delay the state's ability to do some of the projects we'd hope to do.
Okay, we haven't had any discussion relative to the FBI building, the possibility of it coming to the state of Maryland. We have not had any projection or have not had a discussion.
Well, I think as we understand it currently, the plan is for the FBI building to be relocated to Prince George's County. But obviously, with the new administration, new Congress, you don't know whether they will stick to that plan or choose to locate somewhere else.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Senator Benson. From the House, Delegate Wu.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry, I couldn't turn on the camera. My camera is on, so I turn it on. Right. So I have two questions. The first question about the private sector and job growth in your probably early presentation, page 3 or 4. Like you said, the data was wrong. What's going on that? And are we able to fix the data, or actually that's the pattern we're going to experience with really low job growth? That's question one. And question two is about really come for the incoming president, and there's so many scenarios he was proposing, and for example, relocation some of federal agencies or eliminate some jobs. Can we model something based on his previous proposal, see how much less revenue we may not obtain? Can we do that?
Well, I'll take the first question regarding the private sector job data. It will get revised. As I mentioned, there'll be a revision in March, and I fully expect that that data will get revised and revised upwards. I don't know exactly why it seems to be significantly, why it's showing negative job growth. It is based on a survey. I know even nationally, that there has been issues with low response rates to that survey. And obviously with any survey, if you have low response rates, that just raises the potential of error. And I don't know if that's exactly what's causing the data for Maryland to look so odd, but the value of having this annual revision is to look at the data and correct it if there are problems, as there do seem to be this year. In terms of the, I don't know if you're asking about the federal on the budget side, I would turn that back to Dave Romans.
I think the question was more around the, have we modeled if we were to see relocation of federal jobs? I mean, I think, that we have some data in the document that showed, there's about 160,000 jobs in Maryland with wages of about 25 billion currently. So, I mean, it's hard to know what percentage of those jobs might be relocated, but could be, if it was a significant number, that would have a big impact on the Maryland economy, and certainly on a regional basis on certain jurisdictions. I think the other data we had in the document was in 2021, according to the Comptroller's Office, 256,000 Marylanders received federal W-2s. So they had some sort of federal wages. So that maybe captures the larger universe of both people Marylanders working in jobs in Maryland, as well as Marylanders working in federal jobs in the greater Washington region. So that was about 8% of all taxpayers in 2021. So again, we don't have any real way to model what they might propose to do, and a lot of those sort of things will require congressional action. So we'll certainly be monitoring that, but there's certainly a significant risk to our economy. As Teresa said earlier, the Maryland economy isn't growing very well. It's relatively stagnant. So any sort of depressed wages for federal workers or fewer federal workers is going to have a real negative impact on the growth in our economy, and just further exacerbate the already challenging budget situation that we face.
Great. Thank you very much, Chairman Rosapap.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to go back to Dave Romans on kind of the big picture. Obviously, a big projected budget deficit is a big problem. Looking out beyond this year, we knew that by FY28, we had a big bulge with the blueprint commitment. And I guess my question, looking at the next 3 years together, even though FY28 is different than FY26 and 27, conceptually, how much emphasis would you put on unexpected from last year, unexpected changes in spending like Medicaid and childcare and other things like that, and unexpected changes in revenue? Because the blueprint was baked in. The question is why these unexpected changes?
Yeah, I mean, what we saw happen in the kind of current year and the prior year with Medicaid in particular was there was the Medicaid unwinding, where we had to do redeterminations for everyone in Medicaid after not doing redeterminations during the pandemic. And there was an expectation that that was going to reduce our Medicaid rolls and kind of help constrain our costs. The health department was very successful in obtaining federal waivers that let us keep a lot more people on than was expected. So the good news is we succeeded in keeping people in health insurance. The bad news is we had to pay for that health insurance. In addition, we've just seen a spike in healthcare costs. Healthcare costs grew a little bit faster over the last year and a half or so for Medicaid than was expected. So I think there's going to be continued pressures there because our enrollment levels remain quite high, and there seems to be some upward inflation in the healthcare industry. Childcare is more controllable if the state is willing to take cost containment actions. I mean, Maryland has frequently frozen the enrollment in the childcare program or taken other cost containments to slow the growth. Currently, we are not doing that. General Assembly has been sort of loath to do that and actually prevented some of the cost containment that have been proposed from being implemented. So that's an easier one to perhaps constrain if that's something people are interested in doing. I think on the revenue side, I mean, it's hard to be bullish on the revenues growing with this uncertainty in terms of federal jobs and federal money flowing to Maryland contractors. So, I mean, it's always possible the revenues will grow a little. I don't think we can expect the revenues to grow enough to substantially make a dent in the deficits that we're projecting. And as I say, none of these revenues take into account any concerns about the federal government. I've already seen some of the national forecasting companies saying that the new administration's, at least campaign promises around the economy, they believed would lead to a slowdown in the near term in the economy. The tariff concept, for example, perhaps leading to inflation and so forth. So I think there's a lot of reasons to be worried that the revenues are going to go poorly rather than better.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Are there any other questions for Department of Legislative Services? Great. Mr. Chairman, are there any closing remarks from you?
No, sir. It's very helpful.
Great. Well, thank you very much to the Department of Legislative Services for their presentation, and thanks to all the members for their questions. That will conclude today's Spending Affordability Committee, and the next meeting will be on December 17th at 1 p.m. Thank you very much, everyone. Have a great